In April of 1945, the world stood at a crossroads. The war in Europe was reaching its violent end, and the Pacific still burned with terrible intensity. In the midst of these events, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the man who had guided America through depression and war, suddenly died in Warm Springs, Georgia. His passing left the nation in shock. For 12 long years he had been the voice that steadied a frightened people. His words had calmed markets, rallied soldiers, and inspired a weary public. When Vice President Harry S. Truman took the oath of office only hours after Roosevelt's death, few outside Washington knew much about him. He had been briefed on little, included in even less, and carried none of Roosevelt's aura. Yet now he was president at the most dangerous moment in modern history. Truman quickly realized that to govern effectively, he could not be seen as a mere caretaker of Roosevelt's legacy. The memory of the late president was sacred, but it was also a heavy chain. Truman needed to lead as himself, not as Roosevelt's ghost. And so, within weeks he quietly made a choice that shocked many inside the government. He ordered that within official meetings, Roosevelt's name was not to be spoken for 6 months. This was not an act of disrespect, it was an assertion of independence. Truman was stepping into history, determined to shape it by his own will. When Harry Truman entered the Oval Office, it still bore the scent of its former master. The portraits on the wall, the polished desk, the half-finished documents all seemed to whisper with the presence of Franklin Roosevelt. Many of Roosevelt's advisors and cabinet members had served him faithfully for years. They trusted his judgment as if it were divine and carried his habits into every meeting. In those first days, Truman found himself overshadowed by the man whose place he had taken. Each discussion began with comparisons to Roosevelt's words or predictions of what he might have done. To Truman, it was unbearable. The nation was still at war. The generals looked to him for decisions about Europe, about Japan, and about a new weapon that could change the future of mankind. Yet within his own walls, the late president's ghost seemed to guide every conversation. Truman knew he had to break that spell. Quietly but firmly, he issued his command. During meetings, Roosevelt's name was to remain unspoken. His era had ended. This rule was not made for malice, but to free the government from paralysis. Truman needed his staff to look forward, not backward. The man from Missouri would govern with simplicity and steel. He would honor Roosevelt's memory, not through imitation, but through action. The news of Truman's order spread quietly through Washington, but it carried enormous weight. In the capital, where tradition and gossip walked hand in hand, silence could be louder than any speech. At first, the ban on Roosevelt's name felt strange. Secretaries hesitated before quoting one of his old remarks. Generals caught themselves mid-sentence. Cabinet members who had spent years under Roosevelt's hand now found their tongues tied when trying to draw on his example. But something remarkable began to happen. Freed from constant comparison, Truman's cabinet began to listen to him as president in his own right. He spoke plainly, often with rough edges, yet his words carried conviction. The press soon noticed the change as well. Gone were the grand metaphors and smooth political language of Roosevelt. In their place came Truman's sharp honesty, sometimes blunt, sometimes unrefined, but always sincere. The American people began to see him as a working man's president, a leader who had risen from modest roots to command a world in turmoil. Within a few months, the ghost of Roosevelt no longer haunted every room in the White House. Truman's voice filled the silence that had once belonged to another. The 6-month rule was doing exactly what he intended. It was giving birth to his own presidency. This decision came at a time of immense global change. Roosevelt had been a master of diplomacy, charming both friend and rival alike. His relationships with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin had shaped the Allied alliance through the worst years of the war. Truman, however, had never met either man before he took office. He was suddenly thrust into a world of giants and expected to fill the shoes of one of the most influential figures in modern history. His first meeting with Churchill revealed the challenge ahead. The British leader still spoke of Roosevelt with deep affection, often recalling his words as though he was still among them. Truman listened respectfully but made it clear that his leadership would not be a continuation, it would be a new beginning. He preferred direct conversation over polished diplomacy. He demanded facts, not flattery. Though his style lacked Roosevelt's poetic grace, it carried strength and clarity. As the months passed, Churchill and Stalin came to recognize the new president's resolve. Truman's ban on Roosevelt's name was not meant to erase the past but to ensure the present had direction. America could not afford indecision, not with the war still raging and the shape of the post-war world being drawn. In the quiet of those days, Truman's voice became firm. The nation had a new captain, and the course was set forward. By the summer of 1945, Truman had established firm control over his administration. The 6 months of silence had accomplished their goal. He had proven that leadership was not inherited from memory but earned through decision. The war in Europe had ended with Germany's surrender in May, and the world turned its eyes to the Pacific. Japan still refused to yield, and the cost of invasion promised to be staggering. Truman faced choices that no man before him had confronted. Among them was the decision to use the atomic bomb, a weapon whose existence Roosevelt had only begun to understand before his death. Now the responsibility rested fully on Truman's shoulders. He gathered his generals, his scientists, and his conscience. The discussions were grim, the stakes beyond measure. The silence about Roosevelt continued even then, for Truman knew this choice was his alone to make. When Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed and the war finally ended, history recorded that it was Truman's decision, not Roosevelt's legacy, that brought the conflict to a close. The silence had not been born from disrespect, but from the need to act without ghosts. And in that silence, Truman's voice became the new sound of American power. When the guns finally fell silent and the world began to breathe again, Harry Truman stood as the man who had ended the greatest war in human history. The atomic age had dawned, and with it came moral weight no president had ever known. Yet even in victory, the presence of Franklin Roosevelt still lingered across the nation. His portrait hung in government offices. His words were quoted in schools, and his memory lived in the hearts of millions. Truman, though respectful, knew that America could not stay frozen in admiration for the past. The country was moving into a new world of uncertain peace and growing rivalry. He wanted the nation to look forward, to see leadership as a living duty, not as a monument to what once was. Privately, he reflected that the ban on Roosevelt's name had been difficult, but necessary. It had given his administration the space to act boldly. Now, Truman began speaking publicly about rebuilding Europe, about democracy, and about facing the rising shadow of the Soviet Union. Each word came from his own conviction. The Roosevelt era had ended with the war. The Truman era would begin with the peace. Truman's personal relationship with Roosevelt had always been distant. As vice president, he had been kept largely in the dark. Roosevelt had met with him only a few times and had not fully trusted him with sensitive matters. When Truman took office, he was stunned to learn about the atomic project, about secret negotiations with the Soviets, and about plans for the post-war world that he had never seen. The new president carried this with humility but also with determination. He would not allow himself to be another figurehead. Those who had served under Roosevelt soon learned that Truman demanded order and loyalty. He valued honesty more than charm, discipline more than flattery. In meetings, his plain speech cut through confusion like a blade. Over time, the old Roosevelt men either adapted or departed. Those who stayed learned that Truman was no temporary caretaker. The 6 months of silence around Roosevelt's name had forced everyone to adjust, to see their leader as a man with his own mind. The change was gradual but powerful. The government, once bound to nostalgia, now moved forward under Truman's steady hand. The public reaction to Truman's quiet order was more complex. While the instruction itself was never officially announced, whispers spread through Washington and soon reached journalists. Some newspapers interpreted it as a sign of hostility toward Roosevelt's legacy, suggesting that Truman was trying to erase the memory of the man who had guided America through its darkest years. Others, however, defended the president, seeing his action as one of strength. To them, Truman was a man unwilling to live under another's shadow. Behind closed doors, the president explained his reasoning to close aides. He said that the country needed to heal, but it also needed to grow. Roosevelt's memory would always be honored, but if his name dominated every decision, America would remain trapped in the past. Truman's silence was a mark of discipline, not denial. History would later agree. For those 6 months, the White House became a place of action, not remembrance. And when the silence finally lifted, Roosevelt's name was spoken again, not as a guiding hand, but as a chapter completed. The nation had mourned long enough. Truman's voice was now the one that guided the world. In foreign policy, Truman faced a landscape that Roosevelt had only begun to shape. The Yalta Conference had left many questions unanswered. The Soviet Union, once an ally, now seemed intent on expanding its influence across Eastern Europe. Churchill warned of an Iron Curtain, and Truman saw the warning as prophecy. Unlike Roosevelt, who had tried to maintain a delicate balance with Stalin, Truman believed in drawing firm lines. He was polite but unyielding. He believed that peace could not rest on promises alone. It required boundaries, alliances, and the will to defend them. This thinking gave birth to what would later be called the Truman Doctrine, a commitment to protect free nations from totalitarian control. In this vision, one could still feel Roosevelt's influence, but the voice was distinctly new. Truman's straightforward manner, once seen as unsophisticated, became his greatest strength. The world no longer needed poetry, it needed clarity. The silence of Roosevelt's name had allowed a new vision of America to emerge, one that would define the early Cold War. As the months passed and Roosevelt's name returned to public mention, Truman's decision to have silenced it took on new meaning. People began to understand that the ban had never been about erasure. It had been about balance. Roosevelt had been a towering figure, beloved and larger than life, but even his greatness could not define the future. Truman's America was different. It was an America that faced the Soviet challenge, rebuilt Europe, and adapted to nuclear reality. The White House no longer operated under the glow of old ideals but under the hard light of a changing world. By the end of that year, Truman had become the undisputed leader of a new global order. His choices carried the mark of his own will, not of his predecessor's influence. Historians would later call it a turning point, a moment when a nation learned that reverence must never replace reason. Truman's silence about Roosevelt had been both symbolic and necessary. In those 6 months of quiet, he had built the foundation of a presidency that would shape the next decade. In the years that followed the war, Truman's decision to silence Roosevelt's name remained a quiet legend in Washington. Few documents mentioned it directly, yet many who had served in those months remembered the atmosphere vividly. The meetings were brisk, decisions were made without ceremony, and the president's authority was unquestioned. Truman had removed the invisible weight of comparison, and with it came a sense of focus that the nation needed in a time of transition. America was shifting from war to peace, from a world united by battle to one divided by ideology. Every choice Truman made carried consequences across continents. He approved the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe, established the United Nations as a pillar of peace, and ordered the creation of NATO to safeguard democracy. These actions bore his name alone. Roosevelt had once dreamed of a post-war world bound by cooperation, but Truman faced a harsher truth. Cooperation had already begun to fracture. He guided America through that reality not with Roosevelt's charm, but with his own stubborn clarity. In silence he had found independence. In independence he had found strength. Privately, Truman often reflected on the weight of leadership. He once said that the hardest thing about being president was that every decision was final. There was no one left to pass it to. In his first months he had longed for Roosevelt's wisdom, but as time passed he realized that the strength of a leader came not from imitation, but conviction. The 6 months without Roosevelt's name became, for him, a lesson in courage. Many of his closest advisors would later recall that Truman never spoke poorly of Roosevelt, nor did he seek to diminish his legacy. Instead, he built upon it. Roosevelt had laid the groundwork for victory. Truman carried it to completion. The silence between them had not been separation, but succession. It marked the transfer of purpose from one man to another. In that period of restraint, Truman had forged his own identity, one capable of steering the nation into the atomic age. Years later, he would tell a journalist that Roosevelt had given him the hardest job in the world, and the least preparation for it. Yet through sheer will, Truman had proven equal to the challenge. The contrast between the two presidents was striking. Roosevelt had been born into privilege, educated in fine schools, and carried himself with an air of elegance. Truman came from modest beginnings, a farmer's son from Missouri who had worked hard all his life. Roosevelt inspired with charm, Truman commanded with honesty. The men could not have been more different, yet history bound them together in purpose. When Roosevelt died, many believed the nation would struggle without his leadership. Yet within a year, Truman had guided the United States to victory, shaped the peace, and begun rebuilding the world. The 6-month silence regarding Roosevelt's name became a symbolic bridge between two eras. One represented endurance through despair. The other represented responsibility and triumph. Truman's presidency proved that leadership did not depend on birth or eloquence, but on moral clarity and courage. As his decisions defined post-war history, the echoes of Roosevelt's era softened into memory. The country had not forgotten the old president, but it had learned to follow the new one. In that transition, America showed its greatest strength, the ability to move forward without losing sight of where it had come from. By 1947, the Cold War had begun to take form. The Soviet Union extended its influence over Eastern Europe, while the United States sought to defend freedom wherever it was threatened. Truman's doctrine of containment became the cornerstone of American policy for decades. Though Roosevelt's name was once again spoken in the halls of power, it now stood as a chapter of history rather than a living reference. The silence that Truman had once imposed was no longer necessary. The government had found its rhythm under new leadership. Foreign diplomats, once skeptical of the plain-spoken Missourian, came to respect his steadiness. At home, the American people saw in him a reflection of themselves, ordinary, unpretentious, and determined. The story of those first 6 months began to fade into the background, remembered only by those who had witnessed it firsthand. Yet its effect remained. It had given Truman the breathing space to become his own man. Without that period of quiet separation, he might never have commanded the respect that shaped the post-war world. The silence had been temporary, but its results were lasting. When Truman left office in 1953, the memory of Franklin Roosevelt still stood tall in the minds of Americans. Statues were built, books were written, and his voice echoed in the history of the New Deal and the victory in war. Truman, however, departed quietly, without the grandeur that had surrounded his predecessor. Yet historians would later see his years as a continuation of Roosevelt's vision, transformed by realism and responsibility. The story of how Truman forbade Roosevelt's name from being spoken became a tale told by aides and biographers. Some viewed it as a cold act, others as a moment of necessary leadership. The truth lay somewhere in between. Truman had not silenced Roosevelt out of anger or pride. He had done so to preserve the integrity of command. A country could not be led by memory alone. Leadership demanded presence. In the end, Truman's legacy grew in the very silence he had once ordered. The man who had inherited a nation in grief left behind a nation prepared for the challenges of a new century. History would remember them both, Roosevelt for his hope and Truman for his resolve. After leaving the White House, Harry Truman returned to his home in Independence, Missouri, where life moved at a slower pace. He was no longer surrounded by the voices of generals or the weight of global decisions, yet the memories of those first difficult months as president stayed with him. When interviewed years later, Truman admitted that the greatest struggle had not been war, but establishing his own authority in a government still loyal to Roosevelt. He described how even small choices had been questioned in the beginning, as if every action required the blessing of the man who came before him. That was why, he explained, he had asked his staff to refrain from speaking Roosevelt's name. It was a simple rule that restored balance. It forced everyone to live in the present, not in the shadow of the past. Roosevelt's greatness was not in question, but Truman believed no leader could serve the country while ruled by the memory of another. From his modest home, he often reflected on how necessary that silence had been. It had freed the presidency from dependence and allowed the country to adapt to a new age. History, he said, must always move forward, never backward. Many who had worked under both presidents later wrote about the differences they saw. Under Roosevelt, the atmosphere of the White House had been elegant, almost royal. Decisions flowed through careful persuasion, and charm often carried as much weight as authority. Under Truman, the environment changed completely. Meetings began on time, ended on time, and centered on action rather than conversation. Truman valued directness. He preferred brief notes to long reports, and when he gave an order, he expected it to be followed without question. The ban on Roosevelt's name, though rarely spoken of publicly, reflected that same mindset. It was not personal, it was practical. He needed order in a time of uncertainty, and silence provided it. Many aides later admitted that the rule had helped them adjust to new leadership. It created a sense of unity. The White House, once divided between loyalty to the past and duty to the present, finally moved in one direction. By the time the 6 months ended, Roosevelt's memory had transformed from daily presence into dignified history. Truman had succeeded in something few presidents ever managed. He had separated admiration from dependency. Over time, historians came to see the 6-month silence as one of the most symbolic acts of Truman's presidency. It revealed his understanding of leadership at a level few appreciated during his lifetime. A great leader, he believed, must sometimes stand alone, even against the tide of public opinion. Truman knew that Roosevelt's image was sacred to the American people. To silence that name, even for a moment, could have been political suicide, yet he took the risk because he saw the greater need. The government had to focus on the tasks at hand, not the memory of what had been. When the war ended and Reconstruction began, Truman's policies reflected that same courage. He was not afraid to make hard decisions, whether it was the recognition of Israel, the containment of Soviet expansion, or the firing of General MacArthur during the Korean War. Each action carried echoes of that first bold choice in 1945, the choice to lead without leaning on the past. It became the defining mark of his character, the measure of a man who valued truth and action above comfort or popularity. As years passed, the public began to see Truman in a new light. When he first left office, his approval ratings were low, and critics viewed him as an ordinary man who had stepped into extraordinary shoes. But as historians revisited his decisions, the picture changed. They saw a leader who had guided the world through the birth of the Cold War, the creation of the United Nations, and the rebuilding of Europe. The silence he had ordered about Roosevelt's name became a symbol of transformation the moment when America's wartime government turned into a peacetime democracy. Even Roosevelt's old advisors, who had once doubted Truman, came to respect him deeply. In later interviews, some admitted that his strength had surprised them. He had not tried to imitate Roosevelt's charm or intellect. Instead, he had ruled with conviction and common sense. The 6 months of silence became a legend whispered among political staffers as a lesson in leadership. It reminded them that power cannot exist in the shadow of memory. It must live in the present, guided by purpose, not nostalgia. In the end, the story of Harry Truman and Franklin Roosevelt became one of history's most remarkable transitions. Two men, different in class, style, and temperament, were united by destiny and divided by legacy. Roosevelt had carried America through despair and war. Truman carried it into peace and responsibility. The 6 months when Roosevelt's name was unspoken were not about forgetting, but about growing. They marked the moment when a nation learned that reverence for the past must never overshadow the duties of the present. When Truman died in 1972, the world remembered him as the man who made hard choices without fear, a leader who valued honesty over approval and reality over myth. In later years, when Roosevelt's name was again spoken in the halls of power, it carried no shadow, only respect. The silence had long ended, but its meaning remained. It was the silence of transition, the quiet space where one era closed and another began. Through that silence, Truman had given America what it needed most: a leader who could stand alone and speak with his own voice.